There are mornings when one cannot foresee that a single moment will mark the end of a chapter they once trusted implicitly. That morning began like any other, with a cup of coffee still warm on my desk and the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the campaign plan for Aurora Fashion Group, a plan I had labored over until nearly 3 a.m. I am Camila Alves, the brand strategy director at one of the leading agencies specializing in emotional marketing, where every image and word is designed to resonate deeply with the client's heart. I had been with the company for nearly 8 years, dedicating much of my 30s to crafting campaigns for major brands and nurturing the hope that I would one day join the executive board, not through power plays or late-night drinking sessions, but through genuine merit. We didn't just do marketing, we told stories, and I was among the few who could weave narratives that silenced boardrooms, leaving only the client's eyes fixed on the screen. But in this environment, talent alone didn't determine who advanced. Karen Mitchell, once considered an ally, was the associate creative director 3 years my junior, but promoted twice as fast. She joined 3 years after me, but quickly earned the trust of Harold Reynolds, the company's founder. With her meticulously styled blonde hair and a conversational tone that blended humility with a touch of drama, Karen had a knack for making others feel uniquely heard. Initially, I was drawn to her sharpness, and for the first 2 years, we collaborated seamlessly on various projects. There was even a time I believed that if any woman could rise alongside me in this industry, it would be her. What I failed to see was that every time I stayed late to refine ideas or adjust campaign timelines, Karen was acutely aware of my actions sometimes, even before Harold. Gradually, I noticed that her presentations to clients bore traces of my work, yet the name on the final slide was never Camila Alves. I vividly recall the day the team for the global campaign of Gila Cosmetics was announced, a project I had pursued from the initial pitch, even proposing the narrative centered on the emotional journey of women post-divorce. I collaborated closely with the content team, fine-tuning every voiceover line and even the subtle expressions of the model in the TVC's final scene. However, the internal communications email credited Karen as the lead creator. I stood motionless, staring at the screen in disbelief. My name appeared at the bottom of the list, labeled merely as content support, alongside 3 interns and a newly hired designer. I had risen from obscurity, handling overlooked projects and spending sleepless nights salvaging failed proposals that eventually secured multi-million-dollar contracts. I believed that genuine effort would eventually be recognized, but it became clear that some people didn't need to strive. They just needed to be in the spotlight at the right moment. I confronted Karen about this in a private meeting, striving to maintain a calm demeanor. She looked at me, smirked slightly, and said, "That was the executive board's decision. Camila, you need to understand that leadership isn't just about doing the work, it's about setting direction. I was the one who connected everything and inspired the team." I sat silently, realizing I had nothing more to say. The woman who once sought my feedback on captions and speeches was now using the very language I had taught her to justify her appropriation. I left the meeting room feeling hollow, not angry, just as if someone had drained the oxygen from the space I inhabited. After that incident, I became more reserved at work. I still arrived early and left late, but stopped sharing ideas via email and refrained from opening documents outside the office. It felt as though I was under surveillance, every move potentially recorded and used against me at my most vulnerable. My faith in enduring professional relationships, in the concept of teamwork, and in the belief that we achieve success together was shattered. I even began to doubt those who had previously supported me, including David, a longtime colleague I had trusted implicitly. I couldn't discern what he knew or how often he chose to remain silent. A month later, I received an urgent meeting invitation from HR. The subject, restructuring of mid-level leadership. Upon entering the meeting room, I found Harold, Karen, and the head of HR already seated. They were direct. Harold stated, The company is moving towards a more agile model to adapt to post-pandemic changes. We've decided to terminate Camila Alves's current contract to make way for a younger, more dynamic leadership generation. Karen sat beside him, silent, her expression composed, as if she had anticipated this outcome. I didn't protest or react, merely nodded. Each word felt surreal, as though I was watching a video that wasn't about me. That afternoon, I left the company carrying a small box containing my personal laptop, a few books, and a photo from last year's team building event. Just months prior, international clients had mentioned me by name in their closing remarks. Now, there were no farewells, no hugs, no well wishes. Everything concluded neatly and coldly, like deleting an account from a system. I arrived home at dusk, placed the box on the table, and didn't turn on the lights, sitting in the darkness. I began to truly feel the collapse not just of my career, but of the trust I had painstakingly built. Outside the window, the city lights still shone. People hurried along, and I, the one who had crafted countless emotional narratives for others, now couldn't comprehend how my own story had taken such a turn. Some mornings begin not with noise or sudden change, but with an almost imperceptible shift, so subtle that not even the person experiencing it notices. After 3 days of complete disorientation, I started waking up early again, not to go to an office, but to sit at the small table by the window, open my laptop, stare at the blank page of a new document, and begin rewriting the story of my life with the same words I once used for others. Back when I worked at the agency, I used to tell the content team that every successful campaign begins with a real story, and sometimes that story comes from the very thing we are trying to forget. I could not forget the day I was pushed out of the company, but instead of avoiding it, I began writing it down, not to complain, but to understand every detail, every manipulated link in the chain, every meeting where I thought I was the lead, only to discover I had been playing a part in a script someone else had written. I reread old work emails, presentation slides, proposals I had written by hand, only to see someone else's name at the bottom. I no longer felt suffocated by it. Instead, a strange clarity surfaced, like waking up from a long dream and realizing I had let someone else steer for far too long. On the 5th afternoon after being let go, I sat in a small cafe that used to be a casual meeting spot for trusted clients and happened to overhear a conversation at the next table. A group of 3 people were discussing a shortage of strategic talent for a rebranding project of an education startup that had just secured funding. They didn't notice me, but I recognized one of them as an old friend of Jenna, our former receptionist. After they left, I messaged Jenna to check in and asked directly if she could introduce me to the project lead. She agreed instantly, as if she had just been waiting for me to ask. Our first meeting didn't take place in a sleek conference room. There were no whiteboards or slides, just a small round table in a quiet cafe at noon. I told them that many brands today are losing connection with their audience, not because they lack good products, but because they've forgotten how to tell real stories. I showed them a draft of a TV commercial I had once written, but was never aired because Karen said it was too emotional, not in line with the polished image she insisted on. They fell silent after reading it, then asked me just one question: would you be open to freelancing? I nodded. That was the first afternoon I walked home feeling like I still had value, not the kind that gets noted in thank you emails or performance dashboards, but real value, the kind that comes from someone wanting to hear your voice and believing in what you can do. I took on that small project, rewriting the entire brand narrative from tone of voice to spokesperson character. Within 3 weeks, the startup's YouTube and Instagram engagement had tripled, and one of the videos I had written was shared by a prominent industry founder. But what reassured me most was seeing the name Camila Alves officially credited as the scriptwriter. No one took it away. No one edited it and replaced the ownership. When I saw my name appear in the closing credits, I knew I had taken the first real step on my comeback journey. I didn't post anything on social media. I didn't talk about betrayal or what the old company had done to me. I chose silence. Because I knew that the image Karen had built could not stand against the truth once it began to unfold through action. Old clients who had worked directly with me started reaching out again. They didn't need to hear explanations. They just needed to know I was working independently, and they were ready to offer me projects. One of them was James Donovan, a representative from a foreign agency that had once collaborated with my former company. He was surprised to learn I was no longer there. After a few polite questions, he said, "Camila, you should start your own thing. This industry needs people like you." I didn't answer right away, just smiled, but his words lingered with me the entire evening. I spent the next 2 weeks sketching out a rough plan for a startup. Nothing big or complicated, just a small team specializing in emotional brand strategy for small and medium businesses where I could choose the projects I wanted, retain ownership of the content, and most importantly, build long-term relationships not based on job titles, but on trust. I named it Studio Lumen, meaning a small light that reveals the true nature of things, and I invited only 2 people to join me, a designer who had quit due to frustration with the old system, and a young writer I once mentored. We began at the dining table in my apartment, with 3 laptops, a list of potential clients, and the fragile hope that if we told our story with enough honesty, the market would listen. I did not expect that within the first week, we would receive 4 collaboration requests. One of them came from a local tea brand that Karen had previously dismissed as not prestigious enough. When they found out I was working independently, they reached out and said, "You were the first person who made us feel respected." Those words did not make me feel proud, but they helped me understand the true value of empathy, the kind that emotional marketing tries to mimic but often lacks when it does not come from the storyteller's own heart. I also started to see more clearly that I wasn't just removed from the old company because Karen wanted credit. She feared the day people would realize who had truly shaped the success of those major campaigns. And perhaps what scared her most was knowing that I still had the strength to return it. Just wasn't time yet. There were moments when I thought everything would simply fade into silence, that Karen would continue living as the image of a successful woman without question, and I would quietly manage a small studio, working with decent people and letting the past dissolve into memory. But life rarely lets anyone decide how a story ends when it hasn't reached its full conclusion. One early autumn afternoon, I received a call from David, a former colleague I once trusted but had since kept my distance from after leaving the company. His voice was low and cautious, carrying something heavy. He asked if I had time to meet and said only one thing: "There's something you need to know." We met at a quiet cafe tucked deep inside a small alley, far from familiar eyes. David arrived a few minutes late and sat down without speaking. After a moment, he placed a USB drive on the table. I didn't ask. He explained that a new intern who had just switched teams had mistakenly sent him a file. Inside, it was the draft of the Horizon campaign that Karen was preparing to present to GMI Group. When he opened it, he realized the structure was identical to the proposal I had written for a travel brand last year, a version that had never been published. I wasn't shocked, just hollowed by the sheer shamelessness of it. She was still using the same tricks, recycling my old ideas, changing a few names and numbers, and stamping her signature on them. David didn't know I had kept detailed archives of all my unused campaigns, including drafts that were either rejected or quietly removed from the planning board without explanation. I went through my backup drive and compared the documents. It didn't take long to confirm that the entire framework Karen was about to pitch had been reworked from my original concept, but there was one detail that made the situation clear. This version had never been shared via company email, which meant she had accessed my computer when I wasn't there. All the signs pointed back to the quarter when I was reassigned to a support project, and Karen had IT service my workstation for 3 days, giving me a temporary machine. I hadn't suspected anything at the time because I still believed in the system, but now it was undeniable. She had copied all of my data and timed everything to remove me from the picture. Before I realized how thoroughly I had been drained of ideas, I didn't want to create a scene, but I couldn't let it go on either. I sent a short message to Jenna, who now worked at a tech company nearby, and simply said I needed to verify ownership of a document. Not long after, she replied with a data report pulled from my old company server, showing clear evidence of unauthorized access to my concept internal drafts folder on the exact night I was away on a business trip. I saved everything, the access logs, timestamps, an IP address. At the same time, something else started to spread within media industry forums. A young freelancer anonymously posted a story about having their idea taken by a major agency without compensation, attaching screenshots of a script that matched the campaign Karen had just introduced during an internal showcase. The post gained traction quickly, and others began to share similar stories. No names were mentioned, but those in the industry knew exactly who was behind it. I didn't say anything. I just watched the wave rise from the very cuts Karen had inflicted on others, now turning back against her. James Donovan also called again. He was now leading a campaign for a global brand expanding into Southeast Asia. Initially, they had partnered with my old agency, but after running an internal review, their legal team flagged parts of the proposal as duplicative of a campaign previously used in South America. James asked me directly, "Can you confirm who originally created that story structure? Because it matches the draft you once sent me 2 years ago." I forwarded him the original file, complete with metadata, creation date, and our email history. He didn't say much, only asked me to stay in touch because the brand was reconsidering its partnership. I knew what that meant. If it happened, my old company would lose a multi-million-dollar contract, and Karen would be unable to explain how her ideas mirrored a private document I had never made public. 1 week later, news came that the company had called an emergency meeting. Karen was absent, citing health reasons. Jenna phoned me that same day, her voice hesitant. She said, "You should know that someone inside has started questioning Karen, and Harold has begun reviewing the old email systems after concerns were raised by the client." I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt light, as if a long, dragging headache had finally lifted, but it wasn't over yet. An anonymous email arrived in the public inbox of my studio. Attached was a recording of a meeting between Karen and a strategic advisor, where she admitted to borrowing Camila's ideas, but only as general inspiration, and discussed removing me from the company to better control the internal communications. I had no idea who sent it, but I saved it and forwarded it to my lawyer not because I wanted to sue, but as a safeguard. I started preparing for the next phase. Not just scattered freelance projects, but turning Studio Lumen into a real company with legal registration, an advisory board, and a clear expansion plan. Most importantly, with transparent principles of intellectual ownership, the very thing I had once lost. One late night, while reviewing the contract just signed with our first international client, I received a message from an unknown number. It contained just one sentence: "Karen has been suspended indefinitely. Harold wants to meet you." I didn't respond immediately. I just stared at the screen for a long while. What I once thought was impossible was now unfolding in front of me. The person who once told me I wasn't fit for leadership was now being questioned by the very people who had trusted her. And I, the one discarded like an extra piece in someone else's game, now held more of the winning cards than anyone else. I didn't need to speak. The truth had begun to speak for itself, in its own way. There's a certain clarity that comes when one stands on the threshold of return, not the kind of noisy excitement or explosive motivation found in self-help books, but a solid stillness, as if something inside has finally settled, fully aware of who it is and which direction it must take. After weeks of navigating mixed reports about the old company, about Karen, about familiar clients and partners, I came to realize that a true return does not lie in taking revenge or reclaiming a title, but in having the courage to move forward without turning back. I began my days earlier than usual, not out of urgency, but because I needed a quiet moment to reflect on all the material I had prepared. The development plan for Studio Lumen was no longer just notes on paper. It had become a real system, with a stable client base, a core team, internal workflows, and even a training platform for young writers I had once promised to mentor properly. Every step had been built from experience moments of stolen credit, betrayal, underestimation, and the loss of trust I once held so dearly. When I arrived at my meeting with Harold in a quiet cafe near the old office, I brought nothing but a notebook and a calm state of mind. He was already there, visibly older, his gaze no longer sharp but full of hesitation. I didn't begin with blame, and he didn't begin with an apology. We simply looked at each other for a moment before he spoke, his voice low, as if he didn't want to hear himself say it. I was wrong. I stayed silent to let him continue. He explained that after Karen's suspension, the board had reviewed her campaigns and found multiple signs of plagiarism, unauthorized use of assets, and repeated breaches of ethical conduct. Several international clients had pulled out of their contracts, and the company's reputation was now in serious decline. I wasn't surprised. I asked him only one thing. "What do you want from me?" Harold looked at me for a long time before saying, "We need you to verify the ownership of the contested strategies and, if possible, help restore partner confidence. I know I have no right to ask, but I believe you're the only one who can—" I didn't respond right away. I turned to look outside the window, where a young woman was typing on her laptop alone, eyes focused just like I once was, years ago. I didn't agree immediately, nor did I refuse. I returned home, reopened old files, and reviewed the early drafts that Karen had once copied without permission. I no longer felt anger. What I felt was regret. Not regret for the time lost, but for once believing someone like Karen could be a friend, for once thinking the old company was worthy of the passion I gave it. Then I closed those files and opened a new document, titling it Internal Communication Restructuring Strategy, based on creative ownership, transparency. That was the moment I knew I was ready, not to return for anyone's reputation, but to lay a proper brick on the path from which I had once been cast aside. 3 days later, I stepped into the headquarters of the old company for the first time since the day I was let go. It was still the same building, the same hallway with sterile lights, the same front desk where Jenna used to sit. She wasn't there anymore, but I knew everything was beginning to change. The meeting included the entire board, legal teams, major client representatives, and a group of external advisors. Harold introduced me as the original author of several contested campaigns. Nothing fancy, no fluff. I presented my material with no emotional highs or lows, no accusations or justifications, only the truth laid out with clear structure, timeline, and supporting evidence. I didn't try to defend myself or attack anyone. When I finished, I said only one thing. The only thing I want is for this industry to be run with respect for those who truly do the work. After the meeting, I received a formal offer from the board to return as an independent creative strategy director, responsible for rebuilding their intellectual property control process and mentoring the younger team. But I declined. I told them I would provide consulting support for 6 months to help reset internal policies, but I would not return full-time. I had my own path now, and it was far too clear to turn back. Harold didn't insist. He stood and shook my hand, looking at me, for the first time, with genuine respect. As I left the building, there was no farewell, and I needed none. I was no longer the woman walking out in silence with a box in her arms. I was someone who had just re-established the very foundation of the value they had once ignored. That night, I returned to the small office of Studio Lumen. My team had just completed an important project, and we celebrated with pizza and juice. No wine, no spotlight, only the laughter of people who were truly invested in their craft. I looked at the young faces around me, remembering the sleepless nights I had endured over lines that didn't feel right, directions that constantly changed, and the weight of being misunderstood. But now, everything felt different. I had the right to choose how to tell my own story, and this time, No one could take that from me. I needed no loud comeback, no headlines, just the simple knowledge that each morning I woke up living in truth, and that was enough. There is a particular moment I will always remember, not because something grand happened, but because it was the first time I saw myself in the mirror and no longer felt the need to prove anything. One morning, just as the early light touched the edge of the windowsill, I stood inside my own office and watched my team discuss our next campaign. These were young people who once struggled to find direction, now presenting their plans with genuine confidence. I didn't interrupt, didn't correct. I simply listened as they analyzed data, shaped emotional arcs, and outlined the narrative framework. And I realized then that Studio Lumen had truly come into its own. It was no longer just an idea. The grand comeback I once imagined would be measured by big contracts or by proving others wrong had, in the end, revealed itself in much quieter ways, like seeing my team stand strong without needing me to guide every step. 1 month after my final meeting with the old company, I received an email from a former international partner, someone who had once signed a deal with them through Karen, requesting to shift the campaign to my team. They said they no longer wanted to work with a system that lacked transparency and appreciated the way I had handled the crisis, not with noise, but with clarity. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I invited them to visit the studio so they could see the space where creators were called by their real names, where ideas weren't traded for prestige, but protected like precious assets. Around the same time, I heard that Karen had been formally let go. There was no official explanation, just an internal email confirming a personnel change, no press release, no farewell note. She left exactly as I once had. With one difference, no one asked any questions. Jenna, the former receptionist, messaged me a short line. Did you know? When Karen packed her things and left the office, no one said goodbye. I didn't feel triumphant, and I didn't feel pity. I just paused for a few seconds, then closed my phone. What Karen lost wasn't just her job. It was the entire structure of trust she had manipulated to climb. When that collapsed, there was nothing left for her to hold on to. Someone who betrays others might build a career with cleverness, but they will never build lasting relationships that way. There will be no real teammates, no one standing by them when everything falls apart, and most of all, no more trust from the people who once defended them. I still ran into Harold a few times at professional events. His gaze had softened. There was no longer the discomfort from our first meeting, but rather a quiet acknowledgement that I had been right to choose my own path. During a conference on emotional marketing, I was invited to speak about the journey of building Studio Lumen. I didn't talk about being fired. I didn't mention Karen. I only shared that the most important thing in creative work is not who speaks louder, but who listens better, who truly understands what the audience needs to hear at the very moment they feel lost. And to do that, the creator must have experienced pain, been misunderstood, and learned to accept that real value is not always recognized immediately, but it will reveal itself if you hold on to it long enough. After that talk, a student came up and asked if I could go back to the moment before the betrayal. Would I have done anything differently? I thought for a long time before answering that I wasn't sure I would change a thing, because without that push out of my comfort zone, I might still be writing ideas for others to claim, still trying to prove myself in a system where recognition doesn't come from talent but from the ability to survive power games. What I lost wasn't a career, it was my creative freedom. And now I had reclaimed it in a way that belonged only to me. On the day Studio Lumen was honored at an awards ceremony for startups making a positive social impact, I stood on stage with the two people who had been with me from the beginning. We shared a simple story about how we built this team, not with money, not with prestige, but with persistence and honesty. No one mentioned the old company. No one asked about my past. But I knew that everyone who had followed my journey understood this result would not have been possible if I had not once been pushed to the bottom. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I simply moved forward and let the outcome speak for itself. Revenge through success isn't about overthrowing anyone. It's about reaching a point where they have no choice but to look back and acknowledge it. That night, my daughter hugged me from behind as I was wiping down the photo of our new team hanging on the office wall. She asked, "Mom, do you still feel angry at Miss Karen?" I paused for a moment, then smiled. Not angry, but I remember. So I don't forget how easily I used to trust, how vulnerable I once was, how I once thought I couldn't come back. But now, not only have I come back, I have gone far beyond what I ever imagined. There is no bitterness left in me, only a calm clarity that everything I lost has been replaced by things that are far more real. Some battles don't need to be won with words or confrontation. You just need to go far enough without being pulled into the cycle of resentment. And one day, when you look back, you'll see that you walked through the darkest parts and still carried your light. What more could you possibly need? In the end, what truly earns respect is not how you strike back, but how you live after being betrayed.